Journey of Square Peg, Chapter 6, To the Ark. Less than a month later, the tempest that had swept through the cities finally spilled over to the more genteel outlying towns. Stories abounded of bloodshed and looting by gangs. Soon old rivalries saw extreme factions organised against each other, unhindered in the power vacuum precipitated by weakened forces for law and order. For now, the only safe place was at home, and that is where most ordinary people now hunkered down. For 2 weeks we'd kept our children out of school. When it finally closed for lack of teachers or children willing to risk the journey to it, they stopped calling to ask where our children were. I would have celebrated such a consequences of the end of the police state our country had seemed to be becoming in the past, but right now a lack of policing allowed gangs to roam freely, throwing their weight around at anyone and everyone, especially those they viewed as foreign. Thus, they represented a direct threat to my family. Almost at the same time as the oil ran out, I joined a local shooting range in case such a skill would be needed. I wasn't alone. It was doing brisk business, and since the state seemed to be on the back foot, it was easy to get a license. I bought my handgun, a compact G19, at the club, signing to say it would remain there, but there were few checks. Since it was miles from my house, I soon reneged and kept the weapon and ammunition in separate strong boxes in my basement. I had become a reasonable shot, proficient in handling it by then. Who knew what I would be like in a real gunfight? I hoped never to find out. On the night that the first gunshots echoed up from the town, I retrieved the G19 with two 15-round clips from the basement and kept them near to hand at all times. Who knew where this was going? One evening, my wife was listening to a podcast of some orthodox sermon or other. The language was hard for me to follow, but she was lost in it until I asked her the whereabouts of one of my tools. Obviously it's in the garage, she answered, a hint of annoyance in her voice. I later discovered that she hated me asking where things were because it sounded like I was blaming her. Well, if it was obvious, I wouldn't be asking, would I retorted shortly. It was a typical conversation with her these days, so typical that my blood was up immediately. The children were asleep. We could argue with abandon, I thought momentarily. Instead, I stalked out, chuntering what had I done to deserve her reaction. I no longer saw the point of repeating the same damaging conversations over and over again with her. I was emotionally checking out, partly through hopelessness, partly for self-preservation. Was this really to be my life from now on, caught in an endless loop of arguments and awkward silence? I wanted out, to be honest, saw her as a dead weight too often to be healthy for us. I'd done for a long time, feeling hard done by for paying such a heavy price for a decision made years ago. For now, though, the children needed us to stick together, and driven by this fact, I withdrew to distract myself with other matters. Looking out of a window, I noticed my neighbours' lights were on. It was unusual after midnight. Peering through the bare chain-link fence, I saw them sat at their dining table. They were playing cards with all the lamps in the room glowing, reflecting light off glassware. Hot drinks steamed in the lamplight. Perhaps it was a kind of geriatric defiance of the all-powerful beast that was rumbling towards them. Evidently, they would not cower or run as it approached. They would meet it with resolve and good humour. Their positive outlook was enviable, but a great sense of foreboding in me accompanied the sight. I was fearful, not stoic like them. In the kitchen, I heard my wife switch on the local news. It wasn't good. Amid hastily cobbled news reports, the DJ just repeated again and again the official advice to stay indoors and await instructions. It was as if most journalists knew that the events heralded a new social order. Their job didn't seem to matter as much as being with their own people. Why risk their lives, I suppose, for an audience too caught in abject panic to pay attention? The official advice was clearly being ignored by many, their reaction more forced on them than by choice. Society was shifting tectonically, and where the juxtaposed plates met, earth-shattering unrest poured forth. A few days previously, memorably, Gunshots had crackled like burning logs while black smoke belched in columns from the centre of our once well-to-do market town. If it was bad here, it must be terrible in the cities, I surmised. I insisted to Helen that this was all predictable and what I had tried to prepare for. The muted black pistol lay on the table between us as we spoke late into the morning. She had eyed it with barely concealed scepticism and doggedly refused to accept much of what I had argued. Being both a stubborn and optimistic type, she'd tried to placate at first, then simply adopted the opposite stance at every point when that didn't work. "What do you plan to do with that?" she had asked in a pause, eyeing the gun before looking at me with distrust. "You can't take the law into your own hands. The government won't let such a state of affairs continue for long. The kids need us alive, not in prison. God will protect us, not that bloody thing." She was 4 months pregnant and had other priorities far beyond my immediate concerns. She looked at me half with the sympathetic gaze of a nurse eyeing a mental patient, half with obstinate refusal to accept the fate I predicted. The idea that this situation was actually developing to a point where we might need lethal force still seemed absurd to her. A delusion, a good reason to worry about my mental health, even while, it seemed to me, the evidence in my support was billowing from the town as she spoke. "Are you taking it out with you? What if the police stop you?" she asked, frightened by my decision to be armed. "There aren't any," I replied. "That's the bloody problem. Look, there's nothing to worry about with this. It's just an extra insurance policy. If I'm threatened, it should scare people off. If we're smart and act quickly when we need to, no one is going to need to shoot anyone." Feeling helpless, she did not put up much of a fight when I moved the subject on and handed her and my son, who was just 14 by then and was putting together a substantial breakfast behind us, laminated lists of kit we would need to gather in the coming days. He sighed and tutted, but said nothing to me, swearing as he left the room with a plate piled high. Begrudgingly, they collected a handful of items each. They had dragged their feet in protest as usual, the lists soon being shelved in favour of returning to their own interests, gaming in the case of a disgruntled son, religious podcasts and baking for Helen. I had tried not to react to this, choosing instead to complete my list and begin packing the car in the garage. On the night that I saw the neighbours playing cards next door, I had an overwhelming feeling that the time had come. How would I get my family to cooperate? I had to try coaxing them beyond their denial. "Please, can't you see this is serious? Are you waiting for the mob to burn our houses down before you accept what is happening?" "Enough," Helen said, as calmly as she could muster. "Stop bullying us. You're acting like we're going to be killed any second. The shots are gangs fighting gangs. They have no reason to come at us. I want to stay put. I'm pregnant. I can't just leave here. And do you want to wait Rose in the middle of the night for this nonsense?" "Listen, for fuck's sake. If we wait, the roads will be impassable. All I'm asking is that we go to the boat. We don't have to go anywhere on it." "We'll spend the night there, then we're coming back," Helen insisted, a compromise to her mind, an angle to mine. So as they plodded and packed, plenty of extra things were added in. I saw this as them making a point. I would pay by having to pack tons in the car. Personal belongings, luxuries. I didn't openly object. I was glad that they were cooperating at all. As for my daughter, well, she was not aware of the serious purpose behind our rapid harvest. When she eventually awoke in her bed at the noise around her, she simply jumped feet first into doing her bit, packing her clothes and some small toys, her diaries, pens and pencils, ready for the impromptu trip. My spirits were raised. Allies were welcome. Helen was not pleased. When all was ready, I loaded the car the best I could, filled the fuel tank from the emergency jerry can of diesel I had set aside for just this eventuality, and gathered everyone in our living room to try to focus them on the task ahead. The black panes of cold windows reflected the lights around us. "We have to leave here while we can. I've heard there are roadblocks being set up by the thugs. If we don't go now, we'll be stuck here. You've heard the noises from town. It's very serious. We're going to be fine as long as we don't delay. It's important that you do as I say until we're safely on the boat." Of course, My children did not understand the risks that remaining here might entail. Had they known this was it, they would not have agreed to leave their cosy home, their comfortable beds, their friends, the neighbours, the cat. It was with genuine sadness that I too was enacting this ruse, but sometimes tough love is the best kind, and it justified me getting my clan and our kit away tonight. Since my last visit to the neighbours, I had attempted several times to convince them to leave, but it was clear that they wanted to stay close to their family, and nothing would change their minds. On the last visit, they could clearly see my intent, and so they took the opportunity to say goodbye. With genuine love for her, they handed Rose a framed picture of them together with her in their garden, not letting on what they believed rightly would happen soon. Such was their dedication, they laughed and smiled and talked of a next time, even while the sadness was writ large on their faces. We hugged them goodbye. That night, Rose put the picture on her bedside table and regaled some of her adventures with them. I hoped they would forgive us slipping away like this. All set, I returned to the house and made a final check that the entrance to the basement was well concealed. Switching off the lights, I scooped up our cat and carried her outside. In the darkness, she mewed for food. The neighbours will feed you, I told her, scratching her chin just so. The dry store in the basement, shelter to which she had access via a hidden entrance outside, would keep her fed for a few weeks while the mice grew fat beneath the compost heaps. I stroked her mottled fur and listened to her purr. It would be too cruel to keep her on the boat, especially for a long time. She had to stay. Bye, Kitty, I said, heavy-hearted as I stroked her fur. I felt a pang of guilt. Rose would be mad that she hadn't said goodbye to either the neighbours or the cat. The car started far from energetically. It had been quite a few weeks since we'd travelled anywhere together. None of us realised at the time it was to be the last drive we would ever take. Feeling guilty, I looked around at my family, sleep-deprived and exhausted. Each sat silently, not sure which way to look, but certain who to blame for this crazy behaviour. They acted as if held hostage to my mad plan, held hostage by me, afraid to refuse, eyeing the gun in my lap as if it were pointed at them. I felt abysmal for their looks, their silence. But what choice was there? I must endure it for us. We simply must go. Helen clutched her maternity notes on top of a bag of personal belongings, stared resolutely ahead. She believed she would be home tomorrow, but was still paralysed with annoyance. As I jumped out to close the garage door, I saw our neighbours standing at the patio door that overlooked our garden. Hands were held aloft and I returned the gesture, a silhouette in the red light. Lingering a moment before sighing to myself, I climbed back in the car. My passengers had not seen them, yet I felt the accusing looks on me as we drove. They changed a little when we came to the first roadblock. At the corner of our estate with the main road out of town, a hastily erected barricade stretched across the road. In spite of the time of day, it was manned by men dressed warmly against the cool pre-dawn wind. White men with thick cheeks and fat fingers. They brandished shotguns to slow the traffic to a stop, but were careful to point them at the ground once this was achieved. I guess they picked that up from the television, an effort to look professional in their newfound usurped position of authority. Unable to choose an alternative route, I had no option but to pull up and submit to their inspection. A man in a dark blue sports overcoat with a cigarette burning in the corner of his mouth leaned down to get a better look at the occupants of my vehicle, placing a hand on the sill. A tattoo stretched over his fat knuckles. It read, "Love." "Where are you heading?" he demanded obnoxiously. "Relatives," I replied coolly, careful not to catch his eye, lowering my gaze to avoid instigating a fight. "Relatives where?" he pushed impatiently. It was a tone of my voice that seemed to fuel his interest. He eyed my wife's Slavic features, inspected my son. "Nowhere," I answered. My unthreatening voice was juxtaposed by the sight of the G19 lying on my lap. It was pointing at him in plain sight, within easy grasp of my left hand, doing all the talking for me. At last I raised my head, frightened, looking at him. It must have been my wolfish eyes, their predatory demeanour that only later I came to recognise, that convinced him I might not be such a soft target to push around. He thought for a moment, calculating how to make a decision that would be his own, on his own terms, rather than accepting the influence of my gun. I could almost hear the grinding cogs. And then he made up his mind. "Stay out of the town centre," he half snarled, trying to brush off the anger at being caught out. "You need permission to go in there now." "Whose?" I asked, genuinely surprised, and a little superior, since I was clearly driving away from town. These dumb bastards were now making the rules, apparently. "Civil Defence League," he spat proudly, for he was evidently very satisfied that his group were now in charge. He banged on the car roof, a mite harder than a mild encouragement to drive on might have been, an act of spite. I didn't risk a challenge. I pulled away without a further word as Helen muttered about him beside me and told off our daughter for scowling at him through the window. I half expected a hail of bullets to follow us up the road. I ground the gears as my grip on the wheel felt weak and my legs were shaking. This encounter having hardened my resolve to escape and thawed Helen's attitude slightly, we made our way steadily towards the marina, slowing at blind corners, hoping to avoid any further stops. We need not have worried. The back lanes were deserted except for abandoned cars as the dawn light rose steadily. We'd made good time right up until our car ran out of fuel just half a mile from our destination. "Brilliant," chimed Helen and Michael together. "So now we have to walk. Are we seriously going to have to carry everything?" moaned Michael. "The essential stuff, yes," I replied. "Decide what's precious to you. Rose, pick 5 things apart from what you can carry, okay?" We set off after about 15 minutes of debating and repacking bags by the roadside, all the while Rose becoming more and more distressed about the situation and asking what she should leave behind. As we hauled what we could on foot to the marina, I wondered about the wisdom of this venture. Maybe Helen was right. Was I panicking over nothing? Maybe it wouldn't last. Perhaps going out on the water was more dangerous than staying on land. But then, if it turned out to be over quickly, we could surely just return in a few days and call it an impromptu sailing holiday. I wondered, how would I get Helen to agree to go to sea? Ensconcing the children in the boat, which was now stocked with a good supply of books, toys and personal belongings, as well as the essentials required for its purpose that I had brought on many previous trips, I placed my pistol in a locker on board and left Michael in charge, while we set off on foot to get the rest of our belongings from the stranded car. Leaving Michael to fuss over Rose's life jacket straps, Helen and I headed back up the pontoon. In the yard we found an old hand cart that came in handy, and since it had removable wheels and sides, I decided we'd rehome it aboard our vessel when all else was finally stowed away. Helen sighed as we trundled the cart along the road. With the cart, we were bringing everything, she insisted. There was no way she'd let Rose leave any of her toys. By the time we returned, it was midday. The sky was blue and clear, birds swooped, and only an occasional gunning engine could be heard over the gentle trickle of the river. Laden as she was with masses of provisions crammed into every possible nook, the barge lay low in the water. "Do you think the car will be okay overnight?" Helen asked, as I checked the oil level in the engine bay. "Why are you doing that? You said we weren't going anywhere." "Don't worry about the car. No one can steal it. And I need to check the oil." "Can you check the freshwater levels?" I replied, trying to deflect her. "Why?" she asked suspiciously. "Just interested to see if that leak is fixed," I lied. In a moment we would set off on a journey that may mean not stepping foot on land again for days, even weeks. Provisions were plentiful. Since learning Helen was pregnant, I had even insulated what I could reach of the hull with nappy sacks and everything I could think of that might make our stay bearable, just in case the worst happened. I had prepared as well as I could. It was time to put my plan into action, starting with a long trip downriver. The family had headed below to make lunch. The opportunity presented itself. Surreptitiously creeping along the decks, my heart beating fast, I let slip the lines that secured our vessel to the pontoon and pushed off, waiting to drift clear. Then I fired up the engine. Helen appeared by a porthole below with a book in one hand, tea in the other. Seeing we had launched, she reacted. "What are you doing?" she demanded, clambering up into the wheelhouse to confront me. "You promised," she snarled over the noise of the engine. My momentary sense of adventure, as the plan unfurled, was quickly replaced by the all too familiar feeling of conflict. The sense of guilt, the overwhelming urgency, the sleepless night. It was all too much. "Stop fucking nagging," I yelled at her. "The world is going to shit and I'll be damned if I'm going to let my kids die because you won't acknowledge that. If you want to get off this boat, you're going to have to swim." "How can you do this?" she screamed at me, and then the tears came as she lunged for the wheel. "Please, Helen, don't. We'll come back tomorrow, I promise. Let this be what it is, please." Helen, tears streaming, let go of the wheel, grabbed her phone from the chart table and retreated below. "Why are you being like this?" she cried. I had no fresh answers and set resolutely to steering. Misery pervaded every ounce of my soul. I'd kidnapped my family. Flowing steadily, the river grasped our tiny ark of all that was dear to me and carried it gently downstream. Leaving the engine to idle, I let the current carry us. All around was peaceful. It would have been idyllic in other circumstances. Passing fields were dotted with muddy, fat cattle. Ducks and pigeons strutted on the distant banks as the vessel meandered by. I could not enjoy it. Ours was a raft of discontent. At first the others stayed below as Helen telephoned her family to remonstrate about her situation. I feared we would be met by police at some point, especially when at last the children emerged and sat atop the broad deck of the barge, taking in the sights and enjoying the warm sun on their tired faces, while Helen could be heard speaking below. I tried to ignore my own doubts and point out interesting things to the children. Looking back, I think we all would have savoured this moment more if we had known that such pastoral scenes would soon be consigned to history. Later, when whatever arrangements she had made failed to materialise, Helen came to me. She tried to reason with me. She told me this was mad to leave them on the bank. They would find their own way home. I resolutely ignored it all. Frustrated, she wordlessly retreated again, gathering the children with her, perhaps to await her chance. As the day began to ebb, as thoughts of the crime I had committed swirled in my head, the buildings around the harbour came into view. The breeze turned and the clamour of horns and sirens beyond the waterfront houses grew clearer. Hearing the din and keen to see the cause, Michael crouched near the foredeck hatch, wearing a warm woolen jumper despite the mild evening. Growing visibly tense as the noise increased, he watched the greying, muddy banks intently and listened to his sister talking to their mum below. Before long, I switched on the running lights and overcame my compulsion to hasten our journey by increasing the engine revs. Right now we were moving like a driftwood log. I dared not risk drawing more attention to us than absolutely necessary. So the propeller turned just enough to control us as we rode the current into the calm water within the harbour perimeter, crossing eddies where the salt water of the sea met the fresh water of the river. With a noise of shouting crowds rising, our eyes became wider, perpetually scanning as we slipped past empty berths in endless marinas dotted along the widening banks. Halyards clinked against aluminium masts on yachts yet to be disturbed. Gulls rode the breeze above us, keeping their distance from the turmoil below. By late evening, we had reached a cluster of yachts gathered like a flock of frightened sheep in the open water ahead of the gap in the harbour wall. There was no physical barrier to them leaving. They were trapped only by indecision. The reason soon became clear. On the walkway to one side of the gap was gathered a throng of people snarling and angry. They were engaged in a riotous battle with an opposing crowd gathered on the adjacent quayside. The roar of voices seemed to reach inside me, filling me to the core with fear. Over the water, bottles, bricks, and all manner of detritus traced parabolic trajectories to smash down on the opposing crowds. Distant shots rang out as the pitched battle surged and retreated by the water's edge. Horrified, I saw a small vessel that had become jammed against the harbour wall by the current. A prostrate figure lay in its cockpit, receiving much of the hard rain of objects that fell short of their intended targets on the ledge above. Loaded by the increasing weight of the landing cargo, his sloop hung low in the water as bright red blood trickled out below its stern rail. Michael stared in horror, looking back at me along the deck to share his reaction. He called something to Helen. To leave, we must motor perilously close to the deadly deluge too, but there was no choice. If we remained, we had no way of knowing how the harrowing tide of conflict might turn, and we were within easy reach of the shore for anyone minded to try to board our vessel or pelt it from dry land. Before we came into range, at my instruction, Michael, who was grim-faced and nervous, snapped into action. No longer defying me, he began to rush around the deck, bolting the rough retrofitted wooden blackout shutters over our windows. Below deck, Helen switched off our lights so that our boat now floated as dark as we could make her. "So this is supposed to be safer than home," she scoffed below. "How dare you put this on us?" I had no choice, I thought. I had no choice. Peering through a hole in the shutter over the bridge window, I breathed a sigh of relief as I watched my son drop down through the foredeck hatch and, aiming our bow at the gap in the wall 200 metres ahead, opened up the throttle. With the engine noise projecting out from our low-slung barge to the crowd on shore, it wasn't long before some turned their attention on us. Objects began to strike the barge. Glass smashed on the shutters as it ricocheted off our gunwales. Frightening thumps from heavier objects made us jump as they struck and skimmed our decks, leaving great scratches as they went. These could be fixed, but what I really feared was a petrol bomb. Fortune favoured us though, for just as we reached the narrow opening, the battle surged towards the quay, preoccupying the riotous mob with a charge away from the harbour wall and towards the town. Behind us, the cluster of yachts responded to the lull, miraculously disentangling to make a run for the gap that we were now slipping through, their decks festooned with sailors unable to abandon their terribly exposed tillers. Being careful not to run down those ahead of us, I hoped for their sake that the combatants on shore did not retreat again too soon, running high on bloodlust, all too willing to harangue anyone in range. An echo of our straining engine bounced off the great stone bastion as we passed through. We were soon bobbing in the open water beyond the harbour, and I breathed a sigh as we got beyond throwing range. Sharing my relief, Michael opened the shutters again, and we picked our way through the ghostly islands of boats dotted about us, their occupants sitting in silent melancholy as the cityscape behind them blazed. A mile away, fireworks and fires reflected on the black, lapping waves near the shore. Tears sparkling in the flickering deck lights rolled down the faces of sea-bound observers nearby, survivors committed to lifeboats they'd never intended them to be, their world reduced to a few square metres on a relentless pitching swell. With my daughter fitfully asleep below by now, my more willing crew helped raise our mainsail. As the wind caught it, I turned our bow until the compass bearing told me we were headed on a gradual tack away from the land, away from all things familiar and the life we had led before. Full of misgivings and uncertainty, my heart heavy with the burden and the sense of loss, I put our country behind us.